Hi and welcome back to another video. In this video, I would like to discuss an argument that I recently published in the journal Religions. The argument is called the Hayafe, or the heaven ab initio argument from evil. I'm making this video because I think that this argument needs to be discussed more, and the video itself is a challenge to an academic challenge to all of those who believe that or argue that the argument from evil does not constitute a challenge to theism. Let me try to explain my argument by first taking a step back and explaining very quickly the problem of evil. The following is not going to be a comprehensive explanation of the problem of evil. Obviously, I have other videos, and there are other videos on YouTube, or those who are interested can always read the literature, which is always the best thing to do. The problem of evil, and there are, by the way, two different aspects of the problem of evil, two different problems of evil, the logical and the evidential. But I'm not going to get into the distinction, because to me personally, these two are the two faces of the same metal. So the classical problem of evil is generated by these three propositions or three statements. The first one is that God is omnipotent. What does that mean? It means that God, and by God with a capital G, I mean the theistic God, is all-powerful. And all-powerful, typically in theology, is meant as a property or an attribute whereby God can do whatever is logically possible. For example, God cannot create another God, because by definition God is an uncreated being, so not even God could create a God, or in other words, God cannot do what is absurd, just absurd. There's a lot to be said. I mean, some philosophers might argue that God, in fact, can do what is absurd, but it's a different story. The second statement is that God is wholly good, and this again is by wholly good is meant that God is omnibenevolent, that God is pure love. And the third one is a statement of fact that some evil exists in the world. What is meant by evil? Philosophers like to say that there are two types of evil. Natural evil, which is the, let's say, for example, diseases, earthquakes, natural disasters, birth defects. All those phenomena and aspects of nature that can cause suffering. And the other type is moral evil, which is the evil, everything that human beings do that can cause suffering. For example, murder, rape, and abuse, psychological and physical. Now, many have pointed out that there's no apparent contradiction among these statements. And so, because the contradiction is not apparent, the contradiction between the fact that there's evil in the world and God has certain attributes, it is necessary to fill in the blanks, to add further statements. For example, that some have suggested that the intermediate statements or conditions that would make those statements clearly contradictory would be that if we add, we specify that something that is wholly good, like God, always eliminates as much evil as it can. Furthermore, if something is omnipotent, it can do anything. And it seems that one of the things that it can do is to eliminate evil. This is basically the classical problem of evil, as it has been formulated by many people since Epicurus, or even probably before him. And so this analysis that I just presented gives us the argument, an argument from evil that can be outlined in many different ways. I'm going to outline it as follows. So essentially, God's attributes, God has certain attributes, which include omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. I explained what omnipotence means and omnibenevolence. Omniscience would be that God knows everything. It knows everything in advance before it happens and so on. So the first premise would state that God has certain attributes. And these are the attributes that theists typically agree upon. The second premise would be that if something has these attributes, so something is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent, then it can eliminate evil, and it knows how to eliminate evil. But evil exists, the third premise states. Therefore, these premises lead to the conclusion that God lacks at least one of the divine attributes. So the bottom line of the argument from evil, or the problem of evil, is that the theistic God does not exist. And this, by the way, I want to open a parenthesis here. That down the ages, atheists have used the argument from evil to disprove the existence of God, to say God doesn't exist. But in fact, when you think about it, even if successful, the argument from evil, as stated, does not disprove the existence of God in general, because it's clearly open to the existence of a deistic God, as in fact is one of the conclusions of my recent article. Obviously, the argument from evil has received many different responses. These responses are known in philosophy as theodicies and defenses. There are very many theologians have presented theodicies and defenses, starting with possibly the most celebrated and most famous, Augustine, an early medieval philosopher. A more contemporary one is Alvin Plantinga, who's still alive, 90 years old, and doing well. But Alvin Plantinga's defense derives from Augustine's defense, or theodicy. And another one that I mentioned, that I consider in my article, is the interesting theodicy formulated by John Hick. Now, let me explain one important component that is either implied or stated by these defenders of God's existence, of theistic God. One of the most important aspects of these defenses and theodicies is the concept of freedom. We human beings are free. We have been created as such by God. Since free choice is obvious, it would be absurd to deny it. Free will is implied in every moral judgment that we make. And rewards and punishments would be useless, would be even unjust if we were not free. So it is implied that the choices that we make are moral choices, and therefore they're free. They're free choices. It's totally up to us what we do in the world. Freedom is implied by the very fact that we wonder about evil. And freedom, furthermore, freedom, this is what John Hick would say, that freedom is worth the trouble. What trouble? The trouble of suffering. Because the world is so full of suffering and evil, but it is worth suffering and experiencing evil because we are free, and it's incredible, exceptional that we are free. We can experience the world. So in other words, God knew about this and thought, well, creating free creatures, they're not puppets, they're not obey just my predeterministic laws. It's very valuable. A world that contains free creatures is very valuable, no matter what, even if they have to experience evil. That's the general idea. So Augustine, that formulated the first theodicy, the free will theodicy, which Plantinga basically copied, essentially says that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil. In my paper, I think I show that God does not have morally sufficient reasons for allowing evil, as I will illustrate. But let's go back to Plantinga, and I quote Plantinga's work, very important work. A world containing creatures who are sometimes significantly free and freely perform more good than evil actions is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. So Plantinga here is saying God created the world and human beings. Now, why? Because a world containing human beings who are free is better than a world that is deterministic, completely deterministic. John Hick, on the other hand, takes a different attitude. He says, one who has attained to goodness by meeting and eventually mastering temptations, and thus by rightly making responsible choices in concrete situations, is good in a richer and more valuable sense than would be one created ab initio in a state either of innocence or of virtue. So we have these two justifications for evil, for the existence of evil. The Plantinga, Augustine, as I call it, explanation, which says human beings are free, okay, and so it's totally up to them what they do. And as Plantinga points out, the only way for God to create a situation where human beings are free, where human beings do not experience evil and suffering, would be for God to determine humans not to experience evil and suffering. But if God determines human beings to be good and never do evil, then God would have to take away that freedom, and human beings would no longer be free. They would be puppets. And on the other hand, we have John Hick, who is saying that essentially he's saying it's better for human beings to experience suffering, okay, because they learn something from it. So there are these two. These are the two, I would say, major theodicies. One that says human beings are free. So whatever they do, the evil that they cause, it's up to them. Don't blame God for that. And the other theodicy, the Hicks theodicy, says or suggests that God knew about evil and suffering. And he didn't take it away, because by exposing human beings, free-willed beings, us, to evil and suffering, we can learn something. Okay? For example, you fall, you scrape your knees, you cry, but then when you get up again, you're stronger. So this is useful to us. All right, so with this in mind, let me now move to my argument that I call the HAYAFE, this acronym that stands for the heaven ab initio argument from evil. And the key to my argument is in the title, heaven ab initio argument from evil. So in other words, I argue that an argument from evil can't be given by considering the fact that God had an option to avoid evil and suffering. That option was to create his creatures directly, or ab initio, directly in heaven. Let me outline the argument and then expose the premises. The argument would look like this. First premise, God's goal is to exist with his free-willed creatures in an evil-free state of eternal bliss. Premise 2, God would want to create his children in such a world if he could, and if evil and suffering were unnecessary. Premise 3, God can create such a world, and evil and suffering are unnecessary. So these three premises, I argue, lead to necessarily to the conclusion that God is either not omnipotent, not omniscient, or not perfectly good. And my extended conclusion that I suggest is that therefore there exists a deistic God that created the universe, but this God is not a person who willfully created the world, or that has a relationship with humans, at least not here in during our existence in the physical world. Therefore, God cannot, God with the lowercase g, by the way, cannot prevent or eliminate evil and suffering. Okay, so the bottom line is that whether you accept conclusion 4 or my extended conclusion 5, the bottom line is that the theistic God does not exist. So my argument is a logical argument against the existence of a theistic God. Okay? And I would love to hear anyone who would like to challenge me. I would encourage you to contact me, and I would love to discuss this. Now, in the remaining of this video, I want to go premise by premise and explain why the premises are true, because in logic, an argument is good if the premises are true and the conclusion follows necessarily. Okay, so what reasons do we have to believe that premise 1 is true? As a perfect being, God's goal is to create free will creatures that choose to love God and forever exist with Him in a state of eternal bliss. Well, I think that the premise 1, it must be true. I cannot see any other explanation of why God, if there's a God, okay, theistic God, why else would God create the universe and create free-willed creatures, other than the fact that God wants to have a relationship with free will creatures? Obviously, God doesn't want to create puppets, but He wants to create creatures that are able to understand the existence of God, to come to God, so to speak, and have a loving relationship with their Creator, and exist forever in a state of eternal bliss, or in a heaven, for example. As in Christianity, it is believed that the goal of existence is knowing God and entering into freely, by the way, freely entering into this relationship with our Creator, which is God, and then move close to Him in what some might call a heaven. What about premise 2? Premise 2 says that God, who is omnibenevolent, would want to create free-willed creatures in a state of eternal bliss, devoid of evil, if He could, and if evil and suffering were unnecessary. Now think about it. If you could, wouldn't you choose to live in a world that is free of evil? I mean, if you could, why wouldn't you? Would you want to live in a world that is full of suffering? But it doesn't have to be full of suffering, even a minimal suffering. Even, for example, experiencing a headache. Why would you want such a world? Unless headaches are necessary, unless pain of any kind is necessary. If you built a world Would you want a world with tooth decay and earthquakes? Or would you not want to have those things if it were possible? I think it's clear that evil does not serve any purpose unless you're thinking of a physical world. We live in a physical world, and so pain can be useful. It is useful because it tells you some information about the world. So evil and suffering are arguably necessary in a physical world. Okay? But they are useless in a non-physical world. So for example, my earlier example, I fall down, I scrape my knee, it hurts, and I cry. But that evil, if we want to call it evil, is necessary because I learned something from it. When I get up, next time that I fall, I'm resilient. I'm more understanding. I know better. And this teaches me that there are other people who suffer. This suffering, this experience teaches me that other people have the same experiences, so I have to be compassionate and understand people and help others. Great. Let's say that I lose my wallet or someone steals my wallet. Again, in a physical world, like the world that we inhabit, this is important. It might lead to some kind of lesson that I learned. But in a non-physical world, if I was not created physically, in a physical world as a physical being, okay, imagine a non-physical being, an unembodied being. An unembodied being, mind you, who was created directly in a non-physical world, in a state of eternal bliss. Now, obviously, in a state of eternal bliss, in a non-physical state, there would be no wallet. There would be no knees to be scraped. There would be no falling down. So, obviously, the lessons that you can learn from such events would be completely useless. Similarly, in a non-physical world, non-physical creatures would not experience loss, death, earthquakes, cancer, birth defects, raping, all the things that we consider evil. They wouldn't be there. Okay? Now, the important part of this my thought experiment is that, which is, again, the bottom line, is that God can create His children in such a world, and nonetheless, His children can be free-willed. This leads to right to premise number 3. An omnipotent God can create free will beings directly in a spiritual state of eternal bliss, devoid of evil. And evil and suffering are unnecessary. Now, why do I say that this is true, that premise 3 is true? Because there's no apparent contradiction. There's no contradiction. It doesn't seem that it would be impossible for God to create a non-physical world inhabited by free-willed beings directly. It's not, for example, like God's creating a square circle. There's an obvious contradiction there. But it's not contradictory. And by the way, let me mention that if it's impossible for there to be a non-physical world with free-willed beings without evil, then heaven is impossible. But I don't think it is. Now, why unnecessary? Because by removing the root of evil, God would thereby remove evil altogether. And what is the root of all evil? Well, material goods. Think about it. Why do we have evil in the world? Because we have a physical world. We're physical beings, embodied beings. We fall, we get hurt, there are birth defects, earthquakes, natural disasters, abuse, physical and psychological abuse. All these, by the way, are caused by material stuff. And they're caused by greed, by lust, because people want to be powerful. They want to have a lot of money, lots of sex, lots of food, properties, notoriety, and so on. But think about it. All these problems that I just mentioned, notoriety, power, hunger, lust, etc. Once you remove the physical body in a physical world, all these problems no longer exist. So my argument is, if God had created, so in other words, let me frame it this way. There was an option for God when he created the universe. And the option was to create a non-physical world instead of a physical one, like our world, our universe. Okay? Create a non-physical world, and because his goal is to create free-willed creatures that can come to an understanding of God and freely enter into a relationship with their Creator and live with his creatures in a state of eternal bliss, then God had this option. The option was to create free-willed beings, but create them in a non-physical, unembodied form, and place them in a non-physical world. Or, as the title of my article suggests, create free-will creatures ab initio, or in the first place, in heaven. Okay? So this creation clearly, in my view, makes the existence of evil unnecessary, and responds to Plantinga's argument, and Hick's argument, and Augustine's argument, and all the justifications, the theodicies and defenses. It responds, it addresses them all, because, see, if God creates if God creates his creatures directly in a non-physical world, then the idea of learning from suffering is completely meaningless. Now, I can learn from the death of a loved one. It makes me stronger. It makes me more compassionate. But if I was created in a world where that type of experience doesn't exist at all, people don't die, then my learning that value, my learning about people dying, will be completely useless in such a world. Okay? And also it addresses the free-willed theodicy or defense, because guess what? God can create free-willed creatures. Okay? They are free. But at the same time, because they're created in a non-physical world where they don't have wallets or money or jobs or disappointment, there's no reason for such creatures to cause evil. Obviously, they cannot cause physical evil, but they cannot cause it. They cannot cause psychological evil either, because what could possibly drive them to abusing psychologically other creatures? Well, I can't think of anything. I mean, you have to consider the fact that God would create his creatures in a non-physical world, and this non-physical world is heaven. It is a state of eternal bliss. If God had created his creatures directly in a state of eternal bliss, what else could such creatures want? They already have everything that they want. They are in a state of eternal bliss. There's no suffering. There's no way for you to experience more bliss than I can experience. That's the bottom line. This is what makes the idea of evil, any kind of evil for any kind of purpose, useless and unnecessary. Now there's an obvious objection. Let's consider the obvious objection. Even unembodied beings, free will beings, can cause or experience evil and suffering. Now, I have three responses, which in a way I've already explained in the course of my explaining my argument. The first response is that if evil and suffering are possible in the world that I imagine, then the world that I imagine is essentially heaven. And this means that then there is evil and suffering in heaven. But for most theists, we know that evil and suffering, that's the whole point of going to heaven. That heaven is a state of eternal bliss where evil and suffering do not exist. Perhaps one could argue that potentially the creatures that inhabit heaven potentially could cause evil and suffering. I don't know. Maybe someone can argue that. But the fact of the matter, according to theists, is that there's no evil, there's no suffering in heaven, and yet the inhabitants of heaven are completely free. The second response is that in the world that I imagine, evil and suffering do not exist. As I have already explained, evil and suffering are caused by psychological and physical harm, and typically over material goods. Think about sex, power, money, etc. But without a body, without a physical world, without wallets and physical things and currencies and money and wealth, there could be nothing over which non-material beings could fight or cause evil and suffering. If you have an example, well, you have to give it to me. Now, to mention this, someone suggested to me, well, think about Satan. Satan was created directly in heaven, and yet he caused a lot of evil and suffering. Well, first of all, I don't believe that that's true, but that's neither here nor there. But in any case, don't forget that Satan was an angel. Satan was created directly in heaven, but Satan was an angel, or is an angel. So it's something different from human beings, something special. And remember that Satan, the reason why Satan wreaked havoc in heaven is because Satan wanted to be God himself. He wanted to rule. But that's not a problem for my argument, because in the world that I imagine, there's no such thing as angels. All creatures created by God are created equally. They're all equal. They get the same amount of attention from God, the same amount of bliss that everybody else gets. There are no angels and humans. They're only God's creatures. They're all equal. And the third response to this objection is that even if somehow you could demonstrate, I don't know how, I cannot imagine how you could demonstrate that non-physical beings can cause evil by exercising their free wills. Even if you could demonstrate that, still, my argument wins, because the world that I imagine would contain way less evil and suffering than the physical world, for the reasons that I explained. Because when you remove the physical aspect of existence, you thereby remove an enormous amount of evil. So I win in any case. Then I conclude that therefore God is either not omnipotent, not omniscient, not perfectly good, which means, in other words, that the theistic God that has certain attributes does not exist. Or, as I like to suggest, my preferred conclusion is what I coined the term deodacy, which is a defense for deism. And I think that the most logical conclusion is that the theistic God does not exist. There is no such God that has a certain relationship with his creatures, at least here during our existence in a physical world. I personally believe that there is a God, but it's not the God of theism. It's not the God who wants you to go to church, to eat certain ways, to dress in a certain way, to pray, to do all the things that organized religions tell you that is true, that you have to do, that is a duty. I believe that there is a God, but with the lowercase g, and this God does not prevent evil or eliminate evil, because this God created the universe, and whatever happens in the universe is up to us, and there is no no other way around. We experience evil, but God cannot or do not want to prevent or eliminate evil. So, again, the conclusion is that the theistic God, according to my argument, is a God that has the capacity to create a non-physical world without evil, and yet such a world can be inhabited by free-willed creatures. But that God, for the reasons that I explained, does not exist, because, well, the physical world exists, and that's evidence that the theistic God doesn't exist. At the same time, what I think there's evidence for, but the evidence has to be supplemented by other arguments that I, for example, discuss in my book, Deism. There's evidence for a deistic God. Okay? And this is the end. Thank you for listening. Once again, I encourage other people to have a discussion with me. This is my challenge. This is a new argument from evil. And if my argument is sound, then it's a very powerful argument against the existence of a theistic God. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.